Well, this is our first evidence session looking into the issue of pavement parking. So for the benefit of the record, would you like to introduce yourself? Chris, perhaps if we start with you.
Chris Theobald, I'm Public Affairs Manager at the charity Guide Dogs.
I'm Rachel Lee. I'm Policy and Research Coordinator at the charity Living Streets.
And I'm Ian Taylor, Director of the Alliance of British Drivers.
Thanks very much. Well, I think the first question is a pretty straightforward one, really. Do you think that the general public understand the rules around parking on the pavement? Who wants to have a bash at that?
Well, I'd say, the rules are inherently confusing. For example, being able to, it's prohibited to drive on the pavement, but it is not prohibited in most circumstances outside of London to park on the pavement. There is, I think, a degree of confusion, but a 2017 YouGov survey that Guide Dogs commissioned found that 55% of people drivers had considered the impact that pavement parking had on visually impaired people, but done it regardless. So we do think that there is a degree of confusion over the rules, but nevertheless, people understand they can get away with it in most circumstances.
That's an interesting stat. So 55% of people knew that it would cause a nuisance to guide dog users.
So for people with a visual impairment, yes, that's what we found in a 2017 YouGov survey.
Did you find anything? What was the mental process that they were going through?
The questions didn't drill down into that. There is also perhaps the argument that some people may be reticent to admit that they don't understand the law, so I suppose that could have had an impact. But nevertheless, many people, many guide dog owners say that they do have discussions with neighbours and people in the street. Often people don't realise the impact, but sometimes they find that their people do go ahead with pavement parking regardless.
Okay, we'll come on to what the impact is in a bit. Rachel, do you think people understand the rules?
I think even if they perhaps have an inkling, they have a sense of entitlement to park on the pavement. So we did an action in advance of the inquiry, and we asked people to actually give their comments on their experience of pavement parking. And I've been through quite roughly, but looking at key words, and this sense of entitlement is one of the key themes that comes up. So things like people saying, well, it's my right, this verge is part of the... Some people think the verge is part of the property that they live in, it's private property, or they assume that it's part of normal parking practice. There's a whole load of themes that come out. Some question whether or not it's allowed. So, for example, delivery drivers might say, well, actually, we've got our 20 minutes, we can do so. We've got to park somewhere. I think there's a whole load of reasons given for doing it, irrespective of whether or not they should be doing it. And it's not enforced, so they become... I'll speak a bit more clearly. So it becomes self-perpetuating, it becomes a habit, it becomes the norm.
So whether people understand the rules or not, they know that there aren't really any consequences if you do park on the pavement.
Yes, that's basically what I'm trying to say.
Ian, so as a representative of drivers, what do the people that you represent say? Do they understand the rules? Are they not bothered, or are they just genuinely thinking, I need somewhere to park? And obviously many of our streets weren't designed for a time when there were as many cars as there are now.
That's true. In the case of our full-time members, probably most of them do understand. In the case of the greater public at large, I think the only answer is some do, some don't, and it varies area to area. For instance, the law in London is different to the rest of the country, and there are some differences in what is done in each individual local council. As regards practice and what people think they can get away with, because there has not been much actual enforcement where it isn't allowed, people tend to just do it. And all right, as always, there is a minority of people who are just so selfish they don't care.
So, before I come on to ask you about what the attitudes of people blocking the pavement is, can I ask you, Chris, I think some motorists would think it's okay to be on the pavement a bit as long as someone can get past. What's the experience for someone who's visually impaired whether they're a guide dog user or whether someone has a guide dog or not. What's their experience when they encounter a car or a vehicle parked across the pavement?
Well, yeah, I mean, it can be hugely problematic even if the pavement isn't entirely obstructed. If you're in a position where you're with your guide dog and the pavement is obstructed to a degree that the guide dog is unable to pass, they would have to go onto the road, potentially between other parked cars, which in itself is very dangerous if you have a vision impairment, because you're advised to use controlled crossings or crossing points. And then you could be faced with a situation where you're going into the road where there could potentially be oncoming traffic. And that's a terrifying experience for many people. And time and time again, we hear people, guide dog owners and other people with the vision impairment we work with. There are 2 million people with some form of sight loss in the UK and 360,000 people who are registered blind or partially sighted, who find that it just puts them off from going out independently altogether. And when you train these incredible dogs and with the support of the British public, and to give people independence, the confidence to live their lives the way they choose, and then when they find they can't do that because of parking on the street, and it's not just guide dog owners as well, it's a whole range of people, we understand, it's incredibly frustrating.
So would you make a distinction, or would the people that you represent make a distinction between someone blocking the pavement, as in leaving insufficient space for someone to get past with a double buggy or with their guide dog, and someone parking with a couple of wheels on the pavement but where there's still space to get past?
We appreciate in some circumstances, in some areas, I know, for example, in some London boroughs, there are streets in which a degree of pavement parking, as long as people can pass, is permitted. As I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be completely obstructed for the guide dog to actually believe it's unsafe to proceed. And also 2 wheels on in areas where the streets haven't been designed for that. You've got to remember street pavements aren't designed for the weight of cars, so that can still cause cracked and broken pavements, which in themselves are a hazard for people with sight loss and all pedestrians.
Thanks. Rachel, what do Living Streets, what's their view on pavement parking and what the problems it causes for pedestrians?
Can I just add, one of the comments that we had back from members of the public was someone who'd actually seen a man with a guide dog walk straight into the wing mirror of a van that was parked on the pavement. So even where there's enough space and the dog has clearance, the accompanying human may not. So in terms of our view, we think the law needs to be consistent. There needs to be a culture change around the acceptability of pavement parking. And I think only by sending a clear message that you should not presume that you can, it should be a presumption that you can't do it unless you're told that you can. So essentially, like in London, you don't do it unless there are signs saying that you can. So it's not an outright ban, because obviously there are going to be places where it may be necessary, but it has to be safe. And, that could be for 2 people to walk side by side, because we heard from many elderly people that they actually need to walk supported. So it's room for a person and a guide dog, room for a buggy and an accompanying child, because quite often young children will be holding on to the buggy, with mum pushing another child. It's 2 adults side by side so that one can walk aided. It's room for a mobility scooter, for that matter. We heard about people who've been wedged between a car and a wall and then panic. One of the chaps in here who responded with comments said he had to help someone get out of that situation, and someone else's wife is too scared to go out because she got stuck and didn't feel confident to reverse on her mobility scooter. You've got other people who are housebound effectively because they can't get out because there's no room to walk with someone to help them, or because they can't get their wheelchair by. So really the view is that pavements have to be a safe place and an accessible place for pedestrians, because where else are they supposed to be safe? And it's not just the parking as well, it's cars driving up onto the pavement. The number of people who've commented on near misses, and these are able-bodied people as well, someone walking their dog, someone jogging, just because there's a lack of visibility as well around parked cars. If someone's coming in from behind or in front of another parked car on the pavement, you may not see that there's a pedestrian there. There's one story where a child got hit in the side of the head by a passenger door opening outside the front of a school. Now, this child, fortunately, was wearing a cycle helmet. Otherwise, he might not have been so lucky. You know, he ended up in hospital with a dent in the helmet and a dent in his face. So, you know, all of these things have an impact. And vehicles are big, heavy objects. You can't just get by them. You have to go into the road, and it's very, very dangerous. Speeding vehicles as well. You know, once you're in the carriageway, particularly if you've got young children as well, it's not, you know, you can have sight loss, you can have mobility problems, but you could be carrying a young child, and you're going to be at the mercy of a speeding vehicle at 20, 30 or more miles an hour, because let's face it, people drive too fast. You know, we're supposed to be law-abiding drivers, but many drivers, myself including, you know, we drive too fast sometimes. You know, it's too dangerous to take chances with, essentially, which is why we need finally to actually sort this problem out, because the number of pleas I have, you know, within the comments, please sort it out, please do something about it. It's really, you know, it's time we did, and it's been a long-standing problem, and I hope this committee can help, because, you know, I know you looked at it in 2006, you looked at it in 2014, here we are again, and I really hope the government will actually do something this time with your prompting.
Well, there's no doubt we've received hundreds of pieces of evidence. It's kind of more than any other recent inquiry by a long way. So, of course, the reason for holding the inquiry is to do something about it. Ian, just coming back to this issue about motorists, you've said obviously there are a small number of people who are, you know, completely selfish and don't really care. But do you think that the general public and motorists generally understand the potential impact that they're having when they park on the pavement?
Most reasonable people do, because let's face it, just because I'm a motorist, the minute I've parked my car, I become a pedestrian using that footpath as well. So I don't want people blocking me off it. Now, having said that, I know we've mentioned, should it be presumed forbidden except where you're told you can, or should it be the other way round? We do not like the idea of blanket or near blanket bans. It's the principle of one size fits all, and roads and pavements are so vastly different, we don't think one size does fit all. It should be largely up to local decisions, depending on the road and the situation. Therefore, we like the present system whereby you can, unless there's something or someone there to tell you you shouldn't or you can't. It should be made more clear where you can't, certainly. And when people do selfishly ignore that, yes, there is a good case for making it easier for action to be taken against them. I was quite interested in the point about people who are virtually housebound because they can't get access. Anyone who is in that situation has probably got people that need to call on them, be they carers, be they delivery drivers, whatever, who can only do their job if they can park their own vehicles within a reasonable distance of where they're calling. So that's something that needs to be taken into account too. If you did impose a blanket ban, you might need to seriously consider exceptions. I mean, the emergency services is the one that obviously first comes to mind. And so that is why we recommend that. It should be, as long as no obstruction's caused, it should be allowed where it can be allowed responsibly. We have our own ideas on that. I consulted with one of my members who is a retired highways engineer, who said that in one London borough, where the law is a bit the other way, it's Havering actually, they did try enforcing always leave a minimum limit of 1.2 metres. And he said it seems to work, so there seems to be a little bit of evidence in favour of that. That is therefore what we recommend.
Width, isn't it? 1.2 metres, because if you're a double buggy and a small toddler, 1.2 metres probably wouldn't cover it, would it?
Well, I think it would. We originally said 1 metre, but then we received advice that might not cover it, it would be too tight. So we took the technical advice and upped it to 1.2, which should be sufficient for 2 adults, a double buggy, a mobility scooter or wheelchair, or well, most other things you can think of.
So at the moment, motorists are making a judgment about what they think is a reasonable gap, I guess. Would that be fair?
They need maybe some guidelines, a yardstick if you like, or a metre stick if you really like.
Chris, you look like you've got a view on that.
I would say the Department for Transport's Inclusive Mobility Guidance, which is in the process of being updated, suggests that you need to leave 3 metres for pedestrians to safely pass. In limited circumstances, it can be 1.5 metres, but it doesn't go as low as 1.2. And echoing Rachel's comments, I understand that there would be people particularly with wheelchairs and mobility scooters and, as you say, double buggies who would potentially struggle with 1.2 metres there. So I'd believe that's in insufficient space to enable pedestrians to pass by safely.
Okay, but in terms of being clear that we've got all the issues out there, so there's about space to get past and for different sorts of pedestrians, whether they're pushing a pram, walking, aiding someone in a mobility scooter, whatever. There's the issue around people who are driving need places to park, and sometimes they need places to park that are relatively close to their destination, and there's the concern about the damage caused to pavements by vehicles parked on them. Would that cover off the key issues? Is there anything else around those key issues?
Well, we've touched on the wider safety issue of putting pedestrians actually in the carriageway, but I mean it can be wider safety issues for other road users as well. So I mean a cyclist submitted evidence saying that he has to cycle past a car that's parked on the pavement coming up to a junction, and I mean he comes into the middle of the road to turn right at the junction, but the thing is cars behind him think he's just going into the middle of the road to overtake the parked car, when in actual fact he wants to turn right. So things like that not only have a problem and create problems in terms of visibility, but they can also create misunderstandings on the carriageway between other road users and affect their safety. If you have someone walking in the carriageway, you may also get abuse from other drivers. I mean, one person who was walking in the road to get past a parked car faced a barrage from a driver from the other way saying, well, you know, stupid, what you're doing in the road. So there are these wider safety issues, including, you know, if you've got children wanting to cross the road and they can't see past parked vehicles, you know, they have to go into the road to be able to see what's coming. So I think safety would be an overriding issue as well.
I mean, that sounds to be a slightly wider issue, because
Yes.
those issues would apply with on-street parking as well as with pavement parking, wouldn't they?
They could do, but I mean, if you're in a residential area near a school, you know, you don't want to exacerbate it through parking that shouldn't be there in the first place. You know, there may be zigzag lines, there may be double yellows, and people are still parking there, but because it's not enforced, that situation arises.
Okay, let's move on a little bit. Daniel, I'm going to hand over to you.
Hey, good morning. Just some questions to get a sense of where and when the problems are most acute. Is there any evidence on this? We've had lots of written evidence. Is it outside schools? Is it residential parking? Is it shops? Is it delivery vans? What do you all think?
So, do you want me to start?
Sure.
Because I went through. So, schools featured really heavily. I think because of the children, because parents are so intent on dropping their children off as close as possible. Residential areas really, really featured, but also new residential areas. So we're actually designing in the problem with new housing estates, with narrow streets. Quite often, I mean, they're designed for low speeds, but they don't provide enough parking for the number of cars per household. And also, if you have level surface streets and paving, you know, it can be that people are actually parking what's designated as a footway, but essentially people are then walking in the street. So residential areas, times of day, school time obviously, but actually it could be any time and anywhere. I think that's what really came out. Yes, around places like fast food shops, restaurants, or people going shopping and parking down a nearby street, workmen, delivery drivers. One chap who was in a wheelchair lives opposite a police station, and he said he's even been pulled out of his wheelchair before now by an abusive driver. Now, when you've got that happening opposite a police station where pavement parking is the norm, he said, you know, what can I do? He says, if it's happening here, you know, so really, whilst there are going to be hotspots, it is so prevalent that it could be anywhere and at any time.
Chris?
We don't have specific data on the frequency, although, like Rachel, anecdotally, it does tend to be these points around schools. One of the problems that we found is that just the existing regulations are so unclear. So outside of London, if you park on a pavement on a double yellow line, that's prohibited. To park on the footway when the double yellow line is on the carriageway. However, in the case of zigzag lines, so white zigzag lines at a crossing or yellow zigzag lines at a school, actually it's not prohibited to park on the pavement there. It's also not prohibited, we discovered on the way, to park actually on the pavement at a bus stop in many circumstances because of the confusions in the law as it stands. And as echoing Rachel's point, there's sometimes a randomness as well. So, for example, you might be a visually impaired person and you know that there are other hazards as well. You know that that particular street has A-boards, you know that bins go out on a Tuesday and some people are not as diligent in taking their wheelie bins back. You can, to a degree, manage that, but the pavement parking could essentially crop up anywhere. So that can really add to a sense of people's nervousness about stepping out independently.
Ian, an area I'm particularly interested in, because this came up in the debate before, is the extent to which it is local people who are knowingly doing this because it's what people do, the extent to which it is actually people from out of area who are just confused. What's your sense on that?
That can happen both ways. I think I would agree that probably the most public concern probably arises from things like around schools. Now, they do have the added protection of the zigzags, and in many cases it might only be a problem at the time schools come in and out. So that, I would hope, would take care of that. Now, regarding, as I say, other obstructions, I think sometimes we get a bit too concerned about exactly where all the wheels are rather than is an obstruction being caused or not. People parking aren't the only thing. All sorts of things obstruct pavements, be it lampposts, signposts, bus stops, even overgrown hedges, you name it, all sorts of things do, and people have to contend with that as well. And indeed, wheelie bins were mentioned just now. I've always thought there's a bit of an irony there in that we're told to put our wheelie bins out by councils who also put a lot of those other things up on the pavements, and they might be the same authorities that might be enforcing bans on pavement parking, which means you risk getting into the territory of do as I say, not as I do, which is not a good way to get compliance. However, I don't want you to get the wrong impression. I definitely do not approve of people who cause obstruction, whether it be in the highway or on the pavement. And the pavement's a highway too, don't forget. So it's just a matter of proportionality all round, I think. Now, in that respect, I know a lot of some of the London boroughs where they do have this power do actually specifically provide a certain amount of pavement parking, marked out parking. It seems to work. In fact, a few other places do too. I've seen pictures from Bristol. I think, actually, a member wrote to me, I think he mentioned Hemel Hempstead, somewhere anyway. It happens, and I personally have seen it quite a lot in my travels all around Europe. I've seen it in Latvia, in Dusseldorf, in Frankfurt, in a little place in southern Germany called Passau, and I'm sure there are many, many others whereby, as long as the pavements are wide enough, the local authorities actually mark out parking bays. They're half in the road, half on the pavement. So I therefore regard it as a proven system. Sort of, it works, the motorists are happy, the pedestrians are happy, win-win.
I get that, but given we've got two different systems, London and the rest, my sense is that London seems to work okay, and we have fewer problems. Is that correct? I'm looking at Rachel and Chris here. Do we have any evidence on this?
I think there are some problems in London as well. It's all down to enforcement, but I'm really pleased to hear Ian talk about regulated pavement parking. So essentially what we're talking about in having a change of the law is an opt-in system where you would opt in to park on the pavement where it's safe and necessary to do so. It requires a certain amount of upfront investment, because local authorities would have to go around and actually vet the streets to check that they are suitable and wide enough. So that's what we have in London, and why shouldn't the rest of the country enjoy the same, really?
In London, where it's enforced, there is a degree of variation in the level of enforcement between London boroughs. We do have positive reports from guide dog owners that, and we really welcome that in Scotland, in the Transport Scotland Bill, they're including provisions on pavement parking, which would, with some minor differences, broadly bring it in line with the model that we have in London already. So that was something we're very supportive of, and we're pleased is taking place now.
We come to how we do it later.
Okay. I think we want to explore a bit further the question around enforcement. Steve, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Could each of you give me a definition of what you believe constitutes obstructive pavement parking?
Constructive pavement parking.
Obstructive.
Oh, obstructive. Where people risk using the pavement, risk getting wedged in or are forced into the road. That is obstruction, and I'm as much against that as anyone here. If it can be done in the right circumstances, responsibly, without causing obstruction, then let it be. The big question is here, it's the presumption of can you do it unless you're told not to, or vice versa. And a lot of the enforcement of that comes down to how individual councils, who I presume would in most cases be the enforcement authority, would actually carry that out. Now, I know there's a lot of people who are drivers who actually fear that. To put it bluntly, they don't trust their councils not to just impose a ban and send out their wardens on a ticketing spree and penalise them right, left and sideways. I wouldn't go so far as to say most councils would, but it's a perception. Therefore, it might be best to do it the other way round, whereby they have to, and they do have the power to have the traffic orders and impose pavement parking bans locally, where they think it necessary as it is. And I would have no objection to it being made a bit simpler for them to do that in the right circumstances.
Obstructive pavement parking is parking which impedes the free movement of pedestrians.
Okay.
I echo Rachel's calls exactly on that point.
Okay. Good, thank you. What would make an outright ban on pavement parking effective? What would need to happen to make a ban effective in addressing the issues?
We believe there would be there's a real importance in public education concerning the issue. I think, as in with the introduction of any law, it would be about developing public understanding. As we've seen in London, in the Greater London Council's General Powers Act 1974, which sets out the law in London, it does set out exemptions for responsing from emergency vehicles, etc. So in terms of making it work, we would like to see a clear regulated system that gives not just the public understanding, but the people doing the enforcement. At the moment, we see the question of what is an obstruction. That's something that at the moment is left to the discretion of police officers in most areas, and that's actually quite a controversial area in case law, and it's not clear in itself. So clarifying these points in law to have that clearly regulated system would be the way to make a law on pavement parking effective.
Okay.
So, yes, clear law setting out a presumption that you shouldn't do it unless you should, and unless you're allowed to. Most definitely awareness raising, because we are talking about changing a culture of permissiveness that's been going on for decades. Enforcement is absolutely crucial, because at the moment people get away with it with impunity, and unless you actually show that there are consequences for inconsiderate behaviour towards other road users, then why should people amend their behaviour?
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything to add here?
May I add something to that? I mean, I don't necessarily disagree too wholeheartedly with a lot of what's been said. We just want to do things possibly the opposite way round up to a point. One of the things that does cause this behaviour is quite simply narrow roads and lack of parking generally. If you do it in such a way that it takes away the opportunity to park over wide areas, that's going to make life very difficult for a lot of people. It's not going to want to have them comply. So my suggestion here is, although I'd rather not see the blanket ban unless accepted come in, if it did, I'd like to see that go hand in hand with the statutory obligation placed on local authorities to provide regulated pavement parking where it could be done.
Okay. Do you think there's a risk that a ban would simply just displace the problem to other areas? And if so, how would you see we should tackle that?
What we're seeing at the moment with the local authorities trying to do using physical obstructions, street design to manage pavement parking, or with the example of traffic regulation orders, there you can see a degree of displacement because people are taking it from one limited area where they are no longer allowed to park on their pavements to perhaps nearby where they are, whereas the strength of a national law, a more consistent law, would be it wouldn't simply just move it necessarily from one street to the other. Local authorities would have to look at where pavement parking to a degree may have to be necessary, or what modifications would need to be made in order to accommodate a reasonable degree of parking there. So that's why one of the things we see the strength in the national law is it's less of an issue around kind of displacement that we're seeing in some areas where there are some local authorities who are trying to tackle it and really struggling. And I know you're going to, in your next session, talk about TROs in more detail. But that's something that we've had feedback from guide dog owners saying yes, they may have done the 2 or 3 boroughs in the centre of town, but it's just moved the issue just outside of the main area.
Okay.
I think also we want to look at people's behaviour. I mean, it's not to say that people cannot change behaviour. I mean, the fact that people expect to be able to park outside the front door doesn't mean that they shouldn't maybe have to park 5 minutes walk away. I mean, the fact is, if they can walk 5 minutes, what's the problem? You know, at the moment, too many people are suffering hardship because of other people's convenience. And so, you know, whose convenience is most important? I mean, when you're talking about pedestrians, the impacts can be really, really severe. And it's always the most vulnerable. I mean, this is the thing as well. It's the older people, the more disabled people, you know, the mums with children. So, you know, we need to weigh this up, and if it means a little less convenience for the driver, well, so be it, really. At least then everyone can actually use the highway.
Okay. Anything to say? Anything about displacing the problem?
Any sort of ban runs the risk of displacement. The danger with this is that if there is displacement, you then extend the ban to what, and it goes on and on and on. Which is why I once again have to say banning should really come in and be restricted to the areas where they're absolutely necessary and required.
So the last question for me then, some of you kind of touched on this already, but do you think there are other solutions to addressing this problem other than a ban?
Roads not unnecessarily narrowed, very often in combination with wider pavements, which almost begs someone to park up partly on it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean there's room there.
A lot of us would like to see going forward, but you know, we kind of are where we are, aren't we? And so
yes, I mean, I'm
the situation we're currently in.
I'm aware there's a lot of older roads that have got both narrow roads and narrow pavements where you just can't have parking of any sort. But there are others where the road is narrow enough and the not to want parking on street, but the pavements are wide enough for maybe half a little vehicle on it. It's a matter of fitting the rules to the situation. I'm afraid I'm back to that again, rather than one size fits all.
I mean, what we're talking about, and a colleague in Living Streets put this very well, is about the storage of private property on public highway, really. And one of the novel solutions which came up in the comments was to have a council tax charge for more than 2 cars, for example. You know, you have some households which have 3, 4, maybe 5 cars. Well, I mean, it does happen, doesn't it? And at the end of the day...
My household at one point had 6 cars.
And if half of those cars are spilling over onto a public highway, why should there not be an associated cost with that? If you have a 2-bedroom house and you have 4 cars or 3 cars, you know, maybe there should be an extra cost. So it's just an idea, but it is this acceptance that it's perfectly okay to store your private car on that public space. You wouldn't stick, you know, a massive container there and expect to leave it unattended for weeks on end. But you can have a licensed vehicle taking up that space on the highway. And cars, as my friend Kelvin from the British Parking Association would tell you, spend 90% of their time stationary. And they're plonked most often in public spaces. They're not generally in private car parks where you're paying a charge. So, you know, we've got to really think about who pays here. You know, whose freedoms are being affected, who's actually paying the bill for these private vehicles to be parked somewhere.
Okay, to add, Chris?
I completely agree with Rachel on that point again, but just going back to what I was saying earlier, is that the situation at the moment is local authorities in some cases do try and tackle pavement parking. So the idea that we can just focus on areas and do it street by street and prohibit parking there, I think looking at the way TROs operate, looking at the resources of police to deal with obstruction, it's showing that situation simply not working. I mean, we've got 100 guide dog owners coming to Parliament this afternoon in Westminster Hall, and they're talking about their experiences and access, but they're equally happy to talk about their experiences of pavement parking and the frustration it causes. And I'm thinking of some comments from Simon from Ipswich, who's here later, and sometimes he just wants to sometimes he thinks, is it worth even having a guide dog? Because the pavement parking's so bad in his area. He just thinks, well, what's the point? I'm not going to be able to go out independently. And so I feel like the law as it stands just isn't working.
Okay, so Jack, and then Hugh, and then Daniel.
Okay, thank you, Chair. As a number of you have referred to, there are quite a number of streets that will potentially have to be exempt if there is a ban. Do you know sort of what proportion of streets across England might have to be exempt if a ban on pavement parking were to be introduced? No.
No.
I don't know either. I suspect it might vary widely area to area.
We have made efforts to obtain data on this, but unfortunately the Department for Transport don't collate this information. We try to speak to local authorities about this, but that's something that we haven't got data on that. But I mean, if one considers the length of all the highways in England and outside of London, where degree of pavement parking may be necessary compared to where it's not, it's clear the presumption is the wrong way round at the moment, and so that's our view.
And in terms of, sorry, it was just another related question.
Quickly then. In
terms of those streets where you mentioned where it could be done, Ian, and you're suggesting where it could be done. What do you think are the solutions to those streets where it can't be done, where there is really no alternative? We've got lots of very narrow Victorian terrace streets outside of London in many towns and cities in the North Midlands. What is the solution to those areas where really there is no alternative for people who live in those streets to park?
So, I mean, there are many streets in our towns and cities that are very narrow, and quite a few of those will already have restrictions on parking in them, for example, if they're a one-way street. So it's not as though there aren't streets where parking is not allowed, but people live along them. So it is possible to have a street where you're not allowed to park and not have people up in arms. as I said before, what's to stop people parking a little bit further away? So it's actually about considering where they could park. For example, if there's a neighbouring publicly owned car park, you could have a scheme where you offer residents a reduced rate to park in that car park and they walk to their home. That is something that happens in a neighbouring town to where I live. So I think it's about exploring those sorts of solutions and challenging this presumption that you should, just because you have, be able to park in front of your front door. At the end of the day, the pavement is part of the highway. It's where people are expected to walk safely. So, we shouldn't be building in that kind of obstruction to foot traffic, especially when we're trying to encourage more walking and cycling in our towns and cities.
Mayor, yes, there are going to be some streets, as there are now, where you just can't park, and people who move into them presumably should know that and accept it. My whole point is the cases where the situation is different. There's definitely, the only way to help them is to provide more parking spaces nearby. I'm not saying in the same road or anything. None of us have the right to a parking space outside our house. Otherwise, it'd be very difficult to visit people otherwise, wouldn't it? So, as regards the number of cars per household, that's largely down to the number of people in the household and how many of them might need that car to get to work or something like that. So I would not want to pick on people for that reason, because it depends how many people are in the household and how necessary those cars are.
Some really interesting issues about who it would impact if you did disincentivise that, because obviously when you've got more people adults in a house, that they might have more cars than if they can afford to have their own houses each. Anyway, I'm going to move on. So Hugh and Daniel quickly, because we're a little short on time.
Thank you. Ed picks up on Jack's point about the fact that if we do bring in a rule that makes it prohibited to park on the pavement outside of London, there should be exceptions. In reality, isn't it an all or nothing situation? So at the moment, there is nothing to stop anyone parking on the pavement unless local authorities have actually brought in some form of order to stop it, in which case they won't do that because it's too expensive and it just doesn't happen. Conversely, if the blanket ban comes in place, but the local authorities can actually have exemptions, they're not going to make any exemptions because it's too expensive, too bureaucratic for them to do so. And in fact, some of the evidence has pointed to that as well. And we know the pressure's on local authorities. So do we need to be realistic as a committee and not actually think that we can have the perfect situation unless the Department for Transport goes a bit easier on regulation and makes it much easier for councils to be flexible?
They, in respect to that, we would imagine exemptions are not the norm. It is, but in the case of London, they make exemptions via council resolutions rather than TROs. It's a less costly and involved process. So there is an argument for reforming TROs. It doesn't just relate to pavement parking as well. We believe that in terms of the exemption-making powers, that could be made easier by the Department for Transport. So you've got kind of almost two types of exemptions. You've got if there's a degree of pavement parking may be necessary because the street is so narrow, but also in terms of when you've got emergency response vehicles, etc. So there's, as I say, there's almost kind of two types of exemptions there. And again, reiterating back to the London model, because it's what we have, each London borough publishes or should publish a sort of a parking policy which stipulates where it is permitted. And so you can see in some cases, particularly in the inner London boroughs, there's none or very few. Some of the outer London boroughs which share more of the characteristics with the neighbouring suburbs, there might be a degree more latitude, but they do use those powers. But it's really about empowering local authorities to take those decisions, because at the moment they don't have the power to tackle the problem.
Just a very quick follow-up to Chris's point about Chatham Ipswich. I might be able to speak to you later, but I still can't get it quite clear in my mind whether the main problem is the kind of historic cities and places like Stoke, and I have terraces similarly in Cambridge, where actually the parking, it's always there, in which case it's not a great surprise to people because that's just the nature of the area, or whether it is more random examples of people behaving badly. In Ipswich, I can envisage there would be streets and streets where people are always parked on the pavements. Can you clarify a bit where the issue really is?
I mean, from the comments that we have, it's something that we get from people around the country. It's not sort of into specific areas. Relating some of the points made earlier, particularly on some new estates, that's a significant problem. And also in where we have level services, shared services, which is another area that Guide Dogs has significant issues with, which we find that pavement parking is particularly prominent. So I don't think it's unique to a specific type of area. We hear comments from guide dog owners all over the country about where it takes place.
But in those new developments, I mean, those are deliberate policy decisions that have been made to try and dissuade people from having more cars. So that's kind of, it seems to be a slightly different issue from the difficulty we have with old Victorian terraces.
But it's not accompanied by improvements in public transport,
Precisely,
for example.
Yeah.
In all places, we're looking at how people move around, essentially. Yeah. And in our towns and cities, there's an awful lot of vehicular traffic as well, But this isn't just a problem in towns and cities, it's a problem in villages as well, obviously. It's a problem where you have wide pavements as well as where you have narrow ones. I mean, people might complain about the verges being churned up. I mean, there, obviously, you're going to have enough room to walk past, and, it's not quite such an issue. But it's around the acceptability and the culture of doing it. I think that's the biggest obstacle. Yeah. And I know we haven't really talked about the impact on pedestrians, but can I just say that the fear that some people feel about having to go out and dealing with the impact of it, the aggression which they face on a daily basis because of people driving onto the pavement, parking on the pavement and assuming it's fine for them to do it. I mean, the aggression and the abuse that a lot of people receive is one of the recurring themes. And for those who are affected, it is a daily battle. It's wearing, I think, when you think that they've had to put up with it for years and years, and no one wants to do anything about it. I think that's the other issue. I mean, we're talking about a system that is broken at the moment. The council may not have the power or the inclination to do something. The police most certainly don't want to do anything about pavement parking. Quite often it gets battered between the two. Some local authorities haven't decriminalised parking, and therefore it's, I live in South Cambridgeshire, which is one of the 6% that haven't, and it's a major issue there. For those affected, they're knocking their heads on a brick wall, literally. Well, not literally, but it's
maybe sometimes.
Maybe sometimes, yes. And they're the ones who, are pleading for something to be done. And I mean, someone said in their comments, it's common sense, but the trouble is common sense is entirely relative. Some people's common sense is completely different to someone else's, and there are enough people out there who really don't care, have no sense of empathy whatsoever with the impact that they have on pedestrians.
Thanks, Rachel. I think that you made a really powerful point, and it came over very strongly in much of the written evidence that we've received, obviously lots of it from individuals whose daily lives are affected by pavement parking. I'm very conscious that we're running a little bit short of time, and we just want to look at a little bit further at the issues of enforcement. I'm going to hand over to Ruth.
Thinking of better enforcement, do you think it matters who enforces a ban on pavement parking and who has the resources to do so?
At the moment, when we speak with police forces, they just simply don't have the resources to. Most areas have civil parking enforcement. If a law was introduced and civil parking enforcement officers who are already on the ground were able to enforce against it, that would seem to be a logical extension of their role, in our view.
Right. Enforcement. The police don't want to do it. They will say they have not got the manpower to do it. I think inevitably although I'm not without reservation saying this, it's going to come down to those local authorities that have the power to implement bans or otherwise anyway. It doesn't really matter who at the end of the day you give that power to. They're almost inevitably going to come back to you and shout, we need more money to do it. So resources, if you're going to do something that needs resources, those resources have got to be made available. As I say, I know people were mentioning exemptions earlier. If I can add one last quick point to that, I think councils would have to look into exemptions, whether it be either way, through simply public demand. People would clamour for it. In some roads, people would clamour to have pavement parking banned, and in other places, they might clamour for the exact opposite. So that's why there needs to be some duty to take that into account. Also, nobody's mentioned the fact that some of these problem areas, of course, is because the houses are such, it doesn't matter how much they want to, they can't have their own off-road parking space or garages. The thing's just that there's nowhere for them, and a lot of the taking away of road space has actually come about from a desire to stop people driving so much. I would just like to ask you to all bear in mind one thing overall, without getting off subject too much. A certain reasonable traffic management, fine. Where if it steps over that line into what I would call wider social engineering, less happy.
Thank you, Ruth. Do you think there's ways of enforcing pavement parking that are less resource intensive?
Automatic number plate recognition systems, for instance, are used in some places outside schools. They're certainly used in private car parks. Yes, I mean, that would be one way.
And building on that point, the Deregulation Act 2015 limited some local authorities' powers to use CCTV parking enforcement in some circumstances, so that may need to be revisited.
Any other comments around the idea of those less resource intensive? Ian, would you be happy for there to be new technology used to enforce rather than an individual traffic officer, for example?
As long as there's no risk of people being penalised willy-nilly. For instance, if you automate too much, you're liable to go after that poor person that's suffering a genuine breakdown and has had to pull over. So, with a few caveats, no overall objection.
And just when we talk about resources, we've just got to remember the system as it is. It costs local authorities in terms of the damage to pavements, but also in terms of the opportunities. If you've got 35% of people with visual impairment who completed our survey this year said that they encounter pavement parking on a daily basis that forces them to change their route, with a further 35% saying on a weekly basis. So you've got to think about the loss in terms of people's ability to work, travel independently, go to shop, etc., go to medical appointments independently because they can access their community. And so you've got to weigh up those costs as well.
Yeah, some of the hidden costs perhaps that we don't necessarily recognise. Any further questions, colleagues? No? In which case, thank you very much. That concludes our questions to the first panel of witnesses today. Please can I ask our next witnesses to come forward.